Scotland as a nation is 96% ethnically white, with 92% of the population being ethnically Scottish or British. As such an ethnically homogenous nation, it is no surprise then that the national team is also predominantly white. But occasionally we do get players from minority backgrounds, such as Che Adams, Chris Iralumo,
Naismith, that's a brilliant ball, Naismith across!
And Nigel Quashie. Obviously, with such a small ethnic minority population to choose from, it makes sense that we don't have as many players as England, France, Germany, and other large nations who come from these backgrounds. You would then expect that when it comes to the first black player in football, they come from one of these nations. I know you may be thinking of an African country, but seeing as the continent was ruled by imperial powers until after World War II, who restricted what the natives could do, it's unlikely to be there. But this is where we find out that the first black player was Scottish. In 1876, a small Glaswegian team called Maxwell would sign Andrew Watson, meaning they would have the first black footballer. So, seeing as the release of this video is on Black History Month, let's have a look into the story of Andrew Watson and how he became a trailblazer not just in Scottish football, but football as a whole. First, some backstory. Andrew Watson was born in the Demerara region of British Guiana, modern day Guyana, in 1856 and was the illegitimate son of a wealthy Scottish plantation owner called Peter Millen Watson. By illegitimate, I mean born out of wedlock. There are probably connotations knowing the history of colonialism and what went on in plantations, but that's not the point of this video. Andrew would then join his father in moving to Britain and in 1866 would start boarding school in London. 3 years later, however, his dad would pass away, leaving him and his sister with a large inheritance. In 1875, he would move to Glasgow to study maths, civil engineering and natural philosophy, but would drop out to run a warehouse business in the city centre. During his school years, he would play rugby, but in 1876, he would switch codes to association football when he joined the local side Maxwell. His time at Maxwell was short, however, as in 1877 he would join Park Grove, who were another Glasgow side. As a side note, Park Grove had an interesting squad, as not only did they have Andrew Watson, they also had Robert Walker, who was also black, Thomas Britton, who was a Welsh international, and Tommy Martin, who was half Chinese, but at first was thought to be Japanese. Look, they didn't exactly have the greatest knowledge of other nations back then, okay? At Park Grove, he was also made their match secretary, so not only was he the first black player, but also the first black administrator in football. 1880 was when his career would reach new heights when, after being involved in a game between a Glasgow Select 11 and a Sheffield Select 11, again Glasgow would win 1-0, Watson would sign for Queen's Park. Whilst for the past 100 years, Queen's Park have been a bit of a nothing club sitting in the lower leagues whilst remaining amateur until very recently, back then they were the best team in Scotland, having just won the Scottish Cup. Watson would win the Scottish Cup with Queen's Park in 1881 and 1882, along with becoming the club secretary in 1881, meaning the largest club in Scotland, and one of the largest in the world back then, had a black secretary. Despite being born in British Guiana, Watson proved to be incredibly Scottish in his talents, as the Scottish Football Association Annual 1880 to 1881 described him as one of the very best backs we have. Since joining Queen's Park, has made rapid strides to the front as a player, has great speed and tackles splendidly, powerful and sure kick, well worthy of a place in any representative team. See, this whole producing world-class fullbacks thing isn't anything new. Because of his performances, Watson would get called up to the national team, becoming the first black international footballer. His debut would come at Kennington Oval, yes, the big cricket ground in London, welcome to Victorian football, where Scotland would run out 6-1 winners, a result which is still a record home defeat for England. Not only did this game make Watson the first black international player, but also the first black international captain, a role he would maintain for his second cap a few days later, in which Scotland would beat Wales 5-1. In 1882, Scotland would beat England 5-1, which would be Watson's final cap for the national team. You might be wondering why that is the case, but for whatever reason, the SFA in their infinite wisdom would refuse to select players who didn't play in Scotland. After that third cap, The next minority background player to get a game for Scotland would be Paul Wilson in 1975, with the next black player being Nigel Quashie in 2004. From that explanation about why he didn't get capped again, you can probably guess that he left Scotland. You'd be correct, as he would join Swifts in London in 1882, where he would become the first black player in the FA Cup. He would later join Corinthians, who were the English equivalent of Queen's Park, they still remain amateur to this day, along with other top amateur clubs, as this was the day before professionalism really took off. He would rejoin Queen's Park in 1885, winning another Scottish Cup, but his amateur status would change as in 1887 he would join Bootle, who were throwing money about after professionalism was sort of allowed. I say sort of allowed, as despite the FA allowing professionalism, there are multiple instances of clubs getting punished for using paid players in the FA Cup, including Bootle while Watson was playing. Whilst it isn't known how much he was being paid exactly, it is assumed that he was being paid more than fellow Scotsman Robert Calderwood, who had been recently banned by the SFA for professionalism, who was being paid at the time £26 a week. That doesn't sound like a lot, but in today's money that would be around £4,250 a week, so about on par with modern wages. Watson would spend his final years at the Merseyside club until his retirement in 1892, presumably earning a decent wage that would set him up nicely for retirement. So what is Andrew Watson's legacy? Well, as mentioned, he was the first black person to become a footballer, win the Scottish Cup, play the English FA Cup, an international footballer, international captain, and to hold an administrative role at a football club. During his playing days, he was subject to racist abuse by opposition players on occasion, but there were no reports of him being racially profiled by clubs or the SFA when it came to playing him, which, considering it is Victorian Britain, is pleasantly surprising. I mean, it's not pleasant, he got racial abuse off of other players, but again, context of the time period is important here. When he died of pneumonia in 1921, he was buried in Richmond Cemetery in London with a rather unassuming grave, as at the time his achievements weren't really noted. A few years later, however, the Athletic News and Cyclist journals, one of the largest sports newspapers at the time, listed Watson in Scotland's all-time 11 at left back. See, we just love producing left backs. But after his name started to fade away into the history books. In recent years, however, his name has started to be brought up more, with the rise in recognition for achievements for those from minority backgrounds, with there being 2 murals of him in Glasgow, one being on the side of a cafe, and another as part of the first Hampden mural at the Hampden Bowling Club, which is where he would have played for Scotland when it was the first Hampden. Probably the most incredible part of him being the first black international player is when you compare his debut to those who were the first in other nations in Europe. The next black debutant in international football was Vahap Ojalte for Turkey in 1927, 6 years after Andrew Watson died. Ronaldinho would be the first for France in 1931, Eddie Parish for Wales also in 1931, Guilherme Espirito Santo for Portugal in 1937, Miguel Montori for Italy in 1956, Erwin Kosted for Germany in 1974, Viv Anderson for England in 1978, and Chris Hughton for the Republic of Ireland in 1979. The fact that Scotland had a black player nearly 100 years before England, with the modern context of 43% of Premier League and 34% of English players being black, just doesn't seem real, but it shows how incredible Andrew Watson's story is. That's all for this video, and of course I hope you enjoyed. Sorry if it is a bit short, but information on Victorian era football isn't exactly in abundance, but if you do know anything about Andrew Watson that I have missed, then please leave it in the comments below. Of course, the usual requests of liking, sharing and subscribing are appreciated, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!